millimeter in the turret. And they did so. They wanted to reduce the height, they wanted to reduce the crew, and then they couldn't decide whether to do cast or welded hull. It wasn't determined at the time which was stronger. Since then, we have determined that a welded hull is a better hull than a cast hull, because a cast can have imperfections in it if the sand isn't done right in the mold, or you don't do the pour properly. Also, a weld is strong if it's done properly. And we ended up, by the end of the war, doing mostly welded tanks. In June of 1941, we approved this as the medium tank T6, and it looked like this. Oops. Kind of looks like a Sherman, doesn't it? The original proposal, if you look in the drawing, was to have a cupola that would have two 30 caliber machine guns in it for anti-aircraft use and to mow down infantry. After a while, they realized that was giving too much to do to the commander, so they got rid of it.
Was there a certain height for a crew member to be in tanks?
No, I don't think we had developed it, because the average height of the American citizen at that time was about 5'6" to 5'8", didn't matter. Remember, these were all undernourished guys from the Depression. So later on, we hear stories that the Soviets actually did that. I've never actually found any proof of that. So the medium tank T6 rolls out. It still has some features of older tanks. The hatches on the side so guys can get in and out. Again, those are weak points in the hulls. It had two fixed machine guns in the front of the tank. In order to fire, the guy actually had to move the tracks. Again, it was trying to get that infantry tank and that cavalry tank into one thing, so they were trying to appease both branches. But by this time now, General Chaffee, who dies of cancer before the war actually begins, he convinces the Army to come up with the armor branch. And they established that at Fort Knox, Kentucky. And now we start developing a branch and a doctrine and a system to fight tanks as tanks. The M4 is developed out of the T6. It goes into production as the M4 tank, a welded hull tank. It has a Continental radial engine, which was an aircraft engine. Okay. The interesting thing, the person I know up in 32 Mile Road owns an M4A1 HVSS tank. It has a radial engine. To start that thing, you have to crank it 74 times because the oil has to be spread out in the cylinders or it'll crack. I did 36 of them and I was done. Let me tell you, that was a lot of work.
You had to hand crank it.
You had to hand crank it 74 times before you could start it.
You're hand cranking the oil pumps?
No, you're hand cranking the engine around. You're rotating the whole engine.
Really?
You have to do it at least 70.
Did you ever see guys out before an airplane with a radial engine? They turn the prop. They're doing exactly the same thing. They're distributing the oil. Because when it sits, all the oil goes down in the bottom two cylinders. We did 75 and 105 millimeter gun tanks. There was only, usually in a tank battalion, they would have one platoon of 105 millimeter guns. That was a gun tank to throw high explosive at a target, not to fight other tanks. The 105 was our standard artillery piece. It used the same shells, and it could fire them directly at a target to blow them up. We did that throughout the war as our doctrine.
I suppose vulnerable place for the tank.
The turret, and we'll talk about that. The reason why is because it can be seen. I just read, it's been recently found, it was declassified back in the 1990s. It was the study of tank casualties in World War II, and it's recently surfaced on the internet. Most of your tank casualties in the Sherman tank were in the turret. When a U.S. Sherman was destroyed, usually 2 people were killed on average, and usually they were usually in the turret, because that's usually what was hit, because that's what's exposed. We put more armor in the turret. The Germans put less armor in the turret. Does anybody know why? Because they hand cranked their turrets around. It wasn't until later on that they put motors in the turrets. So if you're in that turret doing this, every pound matters. Especially when there's another tank out there and you're really trying to do this. Then Then we went to the M4A1. The M4A1 was a cast-hold tank. But in reality, all these Shermans with the 75 are pretty much the same tank. They might have a different engine, they might have a different hull, they might have different track, but their performance is pretty much the same. This also had the Continental radial engine. A lot of these went to the Brits. They loved it. And when it showed up on the battlefield in 1942, in the desert, the Germans were shocked because they had nothing like it. Their tank, their main tank, was a Panzer III with a 37 or 50 millimeter gun, and suddenly this guy shows up. Now the Tiger was in development, and the Tiger ends up coming out at the end of 1942. But the Tiger was an extremely difficult tank to produce. Only 1,067 of them made. There were almost 50,000 Shermans made. So
How many Mark IVs were in?
it's about 10,000. Well, we'll cover that in detail when we get into the threat. This was an excellent tank in 1942. Probably the best tank in the world in 1942. But by 1943, that may not be true. That's how fast things changed. Later, we will develop the 76 millimeter tanks. If you see a W, that means wet. We'll talk about what wet means later, so I'll throw that out there just to keep you interested. But we end up upgunning to a 76 millimeter gun, and we end up with the better, which the horizontal spring solution. That's where we took the spring and we lay it down, and the tension goes in this way. That allowed for a wider track. And what does a wider track do for you?
Contact patch.
Yeah, contact, the flotation on the ground. Everybody heard about the M1A1 Abrams. As a matter of fact, some gentleman brought us a model. He actually worked at the tank for General Dynamics. They brought a model of the tank. Gentlemen, thank you very much. Who has more ground pressure, an M1 Abrams tank or me?
You.
I do, believe it or not. Per square inch, the Abrams tank, which weighs 70 tons, has less ground pressure per square inch than I do because of the track. I have the ball of my foot in the heel are the only things that touch the ground. Think about that. That's why the Abrams tank is a highly mobile tank, by the way. And that was a problem with the Sherman. It had the narrower tracks. So by the end of the war, we kept wanting to make the tracks wider to get a better flotation in mud. Because Europe is nothing but mud in the winter. The M4A2, this was a diesel-powered Sherman. It had a longer hull to accommodate for the diesel engine. And it was used by the Marine Corps and foreign countries. The United States Army used gasoline in all its vehicles and did not use this tank. The Marine Corps ended up going over to gasoline tanks later. Yes?
What's the difference between, 75 millimeter and 76? How much more bang for your buck is there with a different?
Depends. If you come over here and you see this model, on this side is a 75 millimeter gun tank. Take a look at the length of the gun. Now, if you take a look at the length of the gun here on the 76 millimeter, do you think the 1 millimeter difference has anything to do with anything?
No.
It does in one respect I'll get into later, but it doesn't as far as punch. What matters is the length of the barrel. When you have the length of the barrel is longer, you can have a case, which is this part of the, this is a cartridge, okay? This part is where the powder is, and the powder is what pushes this. Well, what happens if you have more powder? It goes faster. But this powder exploder is a burn. It burns, and it's not an explosion. It sounds like an explosion, but it's nothing but a burn. And where is it burning?
In the barrel.
In the barrel. And it's burning where in the barrel? All the way down. As a matter of fact, when you shoot a rifle and you see that flash come out the end, what is that? That's powder that's just finally burning, and guess what it's doing to the bullet? Nothing. Because it only does something to the bullet in the barrel. So you need a long barrel to make something go fast. Okay? And fast things do what when they hit steel? They go through them. And that's why you see throughout World War II the gun getting longer and longer and longer. The problem is, what else gets longer and longer and longer? This gets longer and longer and longer, and it becomes a problem within the turret. The Panther actually ends up having a problem with the shell being too big, and it was really difficult for the loader to handle it within the confines of his turret. And the Germans were going to develop a smaller one. Wasn't making any sense. Fightability is really important when you're tired and you got to kill another tank. So you got to put that into perspective. And the 76 millimeter is a development of the 3-inch naval gun. There was a lighter version of it, in a way, if you want to take it to that extreme. The 3-inch naval gun is what was put on the M10. In all honesty, the United States Army was lousy at developing guns. Who developed the gun that's on the Abrams tank today?
Germany.
The Germans. It's a Rheinmetall gun, it's not ours. But we don't care. If somebody makes it good, we'll buy it, right? We got the money. But, so that's it. It's you want to have the length of the barrel to push it faster. And the reason why we had to do that was because we found out the 75 was not going to knock out German tanks at range. You'll see that in close range it will, but at long range it will not. Because what happens to that rounds is it's going down range. It's going slower. And so by the time it gets to 1,500 meters, it's going too slow. It hits the Panther tank and it shatters. And the Panther gets mad and shoots back at you. Okay? So that's what happens and why the gun was done that way. But the 76 millimeter ends up being a problem, and we'll see what that. It's a small problem, but it's a problem, which is why the 75 stayed in production at the end of the war. The M4A3 was the standard U.S. tank of World War II. Everything else was a substitute standard. This is what the Army classified as the tank for World War II. It was a welded hull Sherman tank, and it was an excellent tank for its time. But that time didn't last long, because the Germans were also developing new stuff, okay? So you see a lot of variants. They also produced the 105. There was a proposal in 1943 to go to all 105 gun tanks. There was 2 problems with that. The only anti-tank round they could have was a heat round. The heat round uses a chemical explosion, which makes a focused heat, which burns through. There's a debate to this day whether it's burning or it's what they call a liquid. There's a technical term where it's liquid pushing things out of the way. Yeah, they actually don't know what it does. We work, because that's the same thing an RPG does. It's the same kind of. The problem with that is it's a slow going round, and at range it starts to wobble. And what happens when it starts to wobble? It misses the targets. So that was one strike against using the 105. The second strike was they needed the 105 barrels for artillery pieces. So the Army said, you know, we're good with the 75 and the 76. We get to the M4, what's called the M4E8, M4A3 76 wet HVSS, which is called the Easy 8. I think the Easy 8 thing came out from model builders in the 1970s. I don't think it's a World War II term. The M4A3E8 was an experimental tank. The E8 means the 8th drivetrain test for that particular vehicle, and that's what became the HVSS suspension system. We ended up fielding them late in 1944. This was the most produced variant of the Sherman. And here you see it with the 76 millimeter gun on a VVS tank, and here you see it with the HVS tank. And yes, I heard someone mentioning that earlier about the sand skirts. Every Sherman was issued with sand skirts. Why do you never see pictures with them with sand skirts on? First thing to get ripped off was those sand skirts. They didn't last. Why were they on there, though? Still work this problem to this day. I actually worked on this exact problem at TACOM. Why do you put a sand skirt on a tank? Because sand blows up, and what happens when you see sand blowing up? You see the tank. They go, there you are. It was a whole idea was to keep that down. The M4A4 was another, it was the welded version of the diesel tank. This was used a lot by the French and other foreign armies. Again, this was not a U.S. Army tank. The British took it and they put their 17-pounder gun, which was probably one of the best anti-tank guns of World War II, a very high-velocity gun. They put it on this tank. It's called the Firefly. They put one Firefly per tank platoon. What its job was to overwatch the other 4, they call them a tank troop, but we call them a platoon of 5 tanks. The 4 regular 75mm gun tanks would go forward, the Firefly would overwatch them, because it could reach out and touch somebody at long range. Why did the United States Army not adopt the Firefly? Does anybody know? Because we didn't invent it. It's the truth. Sherman Firefly. Okay, here's Sherman production. It was done at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 tank plants in the United States. Did you know that up in Flint, they build exactly the same tank plant that's over there on Mountain Road? I mean on Van Dyke. Exactly the same. It's just backwards. It's still there. I don't know what it's being used for, but it's still there. Look at the numbers built. That's incredible. That's in less than 5 years production. These tanks went on to serve in the United States Army until the 1960s. There were National Guard units still using Shermans in the 1960s. The Israelis were using these in the 1973 war with a gun. Chile, last year, just put Shermans back in the service as training tanks only, but they put them back, they had them in storage. They go, you know what, we can use these tanks. They had the Israelis modify them, they're in the field now. That's an incredible legacy when you think about it. It's an absolutely incredible legacy. These things are still running today, and they were built in the 1940s. But then,
They changed the engines soon?
oh yeah, there's been, I don't think any of them are using their original engines, but
And look how many are train makers,
what?
the locomotive makers,
Yes,
like you pointed out.
yeah, because they had the knowledge of building big things, big heavy things, and they put it to use. I mean, that's one of the great things about American industry in World War II was Singer sewing machine made pistols. You know, that we were able to adopt quickly and take, Rockwell made M1 carbines. One of the GM light companies made the M3 grease gun. I mean, you know, it's just, yeah, exactly.
Why the drop off from production of 44?
Pardon me?
Why the drop off from production of 44? I understand.
We thought the war was going to end.
It did?
Yeah. And one of the lessons we learned in World War I was we kept producing right up to the end of the war because we thought there was going to be this 1919 offensive, and we ended up with all kinds of stuff we didn't know what to do with. So we actually started cutting down production as we saw the war ending, but it didn't kind of end fast enough, so production did continue into 1945. But the war also ended in Europe early in 1945 and then in August. So, plus, we are going to shift to the M26 Pershing tank. Is another, we're going to shift to a new tank in 1945.
Did the production of the M10 and the M36 tank destroyers have an effect on this whole thing? Because that was the whole same engines and chassis and everything, I think.
Actually, it's the other way around. Tank production actually hurt the tank destroyer production because the tank destroyers wanted to find their own vehicle. They mounted the 75mm, the French 75mm gun on a half track. Those things got slaughtered at Zid in North Africa. I actually met a guy who was a gunner on one of those, and he told me about it. They rolled over a hill, he got shot, he laid in the culvert for 3 days while the Germans drove over it. You know, because the thing was just absolutely inadequate. It was too heavy for the chassis, it was cumbersome, and you could see the Germans kind of laughed and like, boom, and killed them all. So they said, well, you know, maybe putting them on a truck's not a good idea, or in a half track's not a good idea. So they needed a chassis to put on, and they wanted it to be a fast, light chassis. The idea of a tank destroyer was it would shoot, move to another position, shoot, move to another position. But they couldn't get the production going, they really never could figure it out. So what they did was they adopted the Sherman chassis for the M10 and for the M36 while they were developing the M18, the Hellcat, which came out later in the war. The problem was it wasn't designed for its function, and it wasn't adequate for the task they wanted it to do. The M10 was, even though it was lightly armored, it was still kind of slow for the doctrine that they wanted to do. So they never really got to that point. So tank production actually hurt the development of the tank destroyer because the Army made the conscious decision, probably the right one, we need tanks more than we need tank destroyers. Because guess what? Much as you think about it, all the great tank maneuvers and all the movies, World War II was still mostly an infantry war. And we need to support our infantry.
Did they ever think about using the Germans, the 88, Toad 88?
Well, that was why we came up with the 90 millimeter, was the development. We took our anti-aircraft gun and put it on the M26.
Which
That
tank
was
did they use to, amphibious tank? Which one did they convert to amphibious?
Those were M4A1s, I believe, the duplex drive tanks. Okay, anybody heard this term about the Sherman? Lights first time, every time, right? That's what the Ronson was. I also think this is a post-war term. I don't think that was called this during World War II, nor do I think the Tommy cooker was actually used by the Germans in World War II. It has been said in the 1960s and 1970s the German Army called the Sherman the Tommy cooker because that's what you did. You hit it and a bunch of British guys got cooked in it. Okay? And a lot of this was this post-World War II image that this is what the Sherman did in combat. It brewed up and burned, which it did do, but not to the effect that we think it did. Again, what did I say in the very beginning? What was Sherman's mostly doing? Attacking. It was advancing towards the enemy. It could be seen. If you can't be seen, you can be hit. When you can be hit, this is what happens to you. Why did Sherman's burn in 1942 and 43? Gasoline, ammunition, anybody else? What does Belton Cooper say? Anybody read his book?
He said poor design.
He said poor design in the electrical wiring. Wrong. And no, it wasn't gasoline. It was ammunition. The gasoline is in the back of the tank. The round goes into the front of the tank. And the problem was, if you look in this diagram, what do we see right here? We see the ammunition. Ammunition was stored in the sponsons. The sponson is the side part of the tank. That's a naval term, by the way. Who designed the first tank? A bunch of naval engineers in Great Britain did. So they use naval terms. The sponsons are these parts of the tank on the side. We put the ammunition there. Because you have these big, you have these, and you've got to put a bunch of them in there, right? Okay? And the crew's got to get to them. Plus they had a bunch in the ready rack right at the bottom of the turret. When an enemy round comes in, and it explodes, or worse, it calls spalling, and spalling is a bunch of hot metal, and hot metal hits this brass thing, what does it do to it? Boom, goes off, right? All that powder burns. What happens to the 20 rounds next to it? They burn too, okay? I have seen a tank burn due to an ammunition fire. It is nasty. I watched an M60A3 in Germany. It had an engine fire, the crew got out, it had light ammunition on board, we all stood back and went, wow, as each round went off. It was a sight to see that tank burnt to the ground, was sitting on its belly by the end of the day, because the fire was so hot. That's what was happening to Sherman's. Enemy rounds were piercing the tank and causing an immediate fire. Not a fire that just starts like a little sparkle, no, an immediate flash fire, kill the crew. It was nasty, okay? So we had to figure out why. Guess what? Every tank in the world was doing this. The Germans put their ammunition in the sponson and in the ready rack. The Russians did too. The only one nation solved that problem, the United States. Survivability improvements. In 1943, we started looking at these right away. The first thing we did was we moved the ammunition outside of the sponson to the turret floor. We put it inside a basin of antifreeze that was surrounded it and put a cover over it. So if spalling occurred and hit, the spalling went out, it might kill a crew member. But it wasn't gonna land on ammunition and cause that ammunition to explode. A fire was not gonna cause that ammunition to explode. At least not in time to get the crew out. Maybe they could put the fire out before it even happens. So we got the ammunition out of the crew compartment. What's really funny, actually not funny, sad, in the late 1940s, 1950s, we went back to putting the ammunition in the crew compartment. And it wasn't until the Abrams tank, and I'm really glad you brought the model because I can show that. And the Abrams tank, all the ammunition is in the back of the turret, behind an armored door. And what happens is the loader, he hits a button, the door opens, he grabs the round, and the door automatically closes, keeping the ammunition away from the crew. If there's videos online where they did the test of it, if the ammunition gets hit, these blast doors at the very back of the turret blow off, and all the explosion goes up instead of into the crew. Really smart design, okay? But it took us 4 years to remember something we already did, because we did it with the Sherman. We took the ammunition, we got it out of the crew compartment. And what the loader had to do is he opened up the door, he reached for his round, he pulled it out, he closed the door by doctrine, so in case he's hit in the meantime, that ammunition's not exposed. Crew compartment fires dropped dramatically because of that improvement. First though, we just put more armor. You'll find Shermans, there's a couple here in northern lower peninsula in front of American Legion post that had this done to them. They actually put armor plates over the area where the ammunition was stored to prevent penetration. And then we painted a nice big white star on it. And there are pictures of a round going right in that white star.
And I always thought that was to protect the driver of the gunner.
They did put, yes, they did put those, there are plates in front that they ended up rolling on, but on the sides they were done to
Both
protect.
side plates were going to protect the ammunition.
Protect the ammunition, and they didn't work. The German ammunition still went through it, which is why we ended up going to the wet stowage. That's what the W means. Whenever you see a Sherman tank with a W in its designation, it means it's a wet stowage tank. Another thing we could do was slightly increase the armor when we went to the HVSS suspension because of the wider track. The suspension and the drivetrain could then handle a little more armor. We went to what was called the assault tank. Post-war, they would call it the jumbo. And that was a hugely beefed up tank. I'll show a picture of it here in a few minutes. But it was not designed to fight other tanks. It was designed to breach the Siegfried line, knowing that it would go in close to enemy contact, which is why they wanted to put higher armor into it. You'll also see lots of pictures of sandbags and welded on armor, just like we did with the Humvees in Iraq. That stuff didn't work, okay? An enemy round would go right through a sandbag. What it did, though, was make the crew think, oh, my tank's protected now. So the patent refused to allow it in any of his tanks because what did it do to the transmission and engine? It overworked it. And it hurt the mobility of the tank. There's the side plates on the picture on that side. And over here you see a crewman pulling the ammunition out of the wet stowage compartment. Field Expedient armor, they would use tracks, they would use sandbags, they would use anything. And the picture on the far with the gentleman walking away, that's Patton after he just got done chewing out a unit for putting sandbags on their tank. This was a unit that was not part of his army regularly, and they transferred in and they had all these sandbags on it, and he was angry at them. And they just got a general officer welcome right there. I had a few of those in my career, they're no fun. Here's the jumbo. Notice how bigger that looks because of the increased armor. Have you heard of the first tank that went into Bastogne when we relieved the 101st Airborne Division? It was a jumbo tank. It had ridden first in Bastogne. It was excited, and it ended up being lost in the U.S. Army system after the war. It was found when we were closing down our bases in Germany in front of the barracks. And it's just been recently restored down at the Armory Museum of Fort Benning, Georgia, which is pretty neat.
Now, did that work?
Yes, these were excellent. They were good at their job, which was to assault fortified enemy positions, like bunkers and Dragon's Teeth and stuff. They were slow. They were really slow because they were really heavy.
How did that extra armor affect the engine and transmission on these? Did they beef those up as well?
I don't think they did. I think what they did was they just said dress lower. And remember, these were used for a very specific task. They were designed to assault they were designed because we were going to breach the Siegfried. That was the reason why we did this. We actually were developing another tank to do that, the T-28. The T-28 was this big tortoise-looking thing. It had 4 sets of tracks on it. Had this huge 105mm gun. It was heavily armored. We built 2 of them. And then they realized, hey, we're never going to get it to Europe. It's so dang heavy. They found one buried out at Aberdeen back in the 1990s. It was buried. So there it is being restored. Hopefully it's been restored to this day. Lethality improvements. Well, we kind of found out that when a tank sees another tank, it does have to destroy the other tank. Okay? The idea that, well, I'll call for a tank destroyer and hopefully he will show up really wasn't working. So, as in 42 and 43, the 75 was an excellent gun. But now as the Panther comes out and the Tiger comes out, it could not hit them at range and destroy them. So we had to go to the larger, faster gun, which is why we went to the M1 76mm gun. The British went to the 17-pounder and the Fireflies I mentioned, but they only produced enough to put 1 per platoon. We produced whole battalions of 76mm tanks. Now, we talked about that 1 millimeter difference, right? The 76mm. Well, when a thing goes faster down a barrel, what do you have to do to the thickness of the shell? You have to make it thicker because of the velocity. If it's not thick enough, it will destroy itself because of the power behind it. And they had that problem at first. So the 76mm, that's one reason why I went to a 76, to give them a little bit more distance to make it thicker. Well, if you have a thicker shell, what can you put less of inside? Explosive weight. You know, over half of the ammunition carried on a tank was high explosive. High explosives used to blow up bad guy infantry, to blow up his bunkers, to blow up the building that he's in. It's just a big shell with high explosive. Pardon me?
It's a heat thing with these shells, they would melt or
No, they would disintegrate. If they were not strong enough, because of the higher velocity in the 76mm gun, it would fall apart. It would just literally fall apart. Which means it would probably go boom and destroy your barrel and hurt the tank. So they came up with the 76. It had a thicker wall to the shell, which means less high explosive, which means less high explosive content you're putting on target. Plus it was a slower to load gun because the shell was bigger. The casing was longer than that one. That's a 75. That 75 was a fast loading gun. When you're hitting an infantry target, which is a bunch of guys, you're not firing one of these at one dude. You're firing at a bunch of dudes. You want a bunch of rounds on targets and you want them on fast. So the infantry commander says, you're not taking our 75mm guns away from us. Oh no. And there's a letter that was written by 4 infantry division commanders telling the Army no. And when commanders in the field say want, the Army responds. So the Army made the decision that both 75mm guns and 76mm gun tanks